Well, thank you all very much for joining the webinar organized with Bridge India and Asha for Education on India's food security during a pandemic. We have 4 great panelists with us today, and I will be introducing all of them shortly. My name is Lakshmi Santosh Mehtal, and I am a project steward for Asha for Education. Asha is a nonprofit organization. It's been around since 1991, and we have 50 chapters around the world that raise funds for education initiatives in India. These are schools and grassroots community projects focused on educating people in all different states across India. And during the COVID-19 lockdown, we have been dispersing funds to support the communities on the ground and vulnerable populations. This month already, we've dispersed over $100,000. In April, at the beginning of the lockdown, we dispersed about $500,000 across all of our projects. So if you'd like to donate, please go to london.ashanet.org and support us. One of our projects is actually in West Bengal, so they've been hit by the cyclone recently as well. And also, if you'd like to help us with any of our project disbursement or join Asha for Education, the email address for that is london@ashanet.org if you're interested. So without further ado, let me introduce our panelists. We have Bhavani Singh Sekhawat. He's the CEO of Akshay Patra Foundation in Europe, which is the world's largest meals program of its kind and a highly respected NGO globally. He's an active mentor and speaker on the London Bureau of Speakers. He's also a board advisor. He's a co-founder of the Utilization Foundation and advises startups as well as faculty in leading business schools around the world. He previously served in global and regional leadership roles with Coca-Cola and Reckitt Benexa, as well as Nielsen, where he was a CEO, regional CEO, and global director. We also have Urvashi Prasad. She's a public policy specialist in the office of the vice chairman at NITI Aayog. She's supporting the work of the government of India's Empowered Group 1 for managing COVID-19 pandemic at the moment. She's also a member of the task force for overseeing implementation of sustainable development goals in India. She's a member of the World Economic Forum's expert network and an alumnus of the World Economic Forum's Global Shaper community. And she completed her bachelor's from the University of Birmingham, UK, followed by an MPhil from University of Cambridge, and an MSc from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. I believe she's based in Delhi now. We have Sahil Shah. He is the co-founder and director of Sustainable Seaweed, an agri-tech company scaling seaweed production for food security and blue carbon skies. He's also an honorary associate at the John Research Group, a NASA-funded US research group. He's a specialist advisor at the US food security nonprofit AllFed, which advises several governments around the world. And he sits on the Chatham House Food and Land Use Roundtable. And finally, Suhrid Patel. He is a agribusiness and rural development consultant and the co-founder of Impagro Farming Solutions. He's worked with the private sector, independent farmers, UN agencies, the public sector, and NGOs. And he has experience working on a range of crops, including sugar, fruit and vegetables, grains, in countries ranging from India to Sri Lanka to Mauritius and Serbia. He has an MSc in development management and a BSc in geography and economics from the LSE, so London School of Economics. So thank you all very much for joining and sharing your expertise during our session today. I'd like each of you to give a 5 to 7 minute overview of your perspective on the unfolding food supply concerns in India, touching on the challenges that already existed and how they've been affected by COVID-19, as well as where you see potential solutions. So Bhavani, I think we'll start with you. Could you give a short overview of your thoughts on this?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me on this panel. Delighted to be here amongst some really learned, intelligent, smart, and bright people, but mostly passionate about food security. And clearly, without it sounding like a cliche, this pandemic took us all by surprise. Not because we didn't have enough food or we weren't prepared, but we never expected for this to become such a big issue, such a big problem so quickly. So if you look at India's overall food ecosystem, it's evolving. Perhaps that's the best way to describe it. It's getting better, but we are still chasing the problem. And not just in India, we're chasing the problem everywhere. The fact that after hundreds and hundreds of years of development, we still have uh, food and poverty as amongst the top three UN SDGs is, to me, a travesty. And I think there are two or three things that clearly emerge out of this, that maybe we've been chasing the wrong indicators, maybe we've been chasing the wrong numbers. And I think today, for example, people are increasingly talking about why we must be chasing the right metrics. And if those metrics aren't right, what should we do to create the right metrics? And specifically on food shortage, the fact that India's had a good monsoon. We are not a food deficit nation, but our problems lie in supply chain and procurement and distribution. And although there are many solutions, a lot of them are still emerging. And, and we still have issues in India, even before COVID, of getting those solutions to scale, whether it was to do with procurement prices, whether it was to do with the right sort of channels between the farmers and the mandi and the eventual consumer, or whether it was just to do with cropping patterns and all of the other things to do with soil and irrigation and those behaviors. The fact that we have still a tremendous amount of disguised employment or unemployment in the farm sector is shocking. It's one of our, if I may, it's one of our biggest diseases. And I think we have Urvashi from Niti Aayog, and she'll probably have a lot more to say about this. But clearly that is a challenge. Our farm productivity continues to be poor. Our procurement and distribution challenges continue to be enormous. Now, when at Akshay Patra, we serve largely school meals. So that's what we do. We serve close to a little over 1.8, close to 2 million children every single morning. And each of these meals is hot and freshly prepared and goes to students who come to government schools. And it really helps the twin objectives of providing great food and providing improved and better educational outcomes. Schools suddenly closed down during this pandemic. And we have 55 of these kitchens and facilities that cook close to 750 tons of rice every morning, 30 to 50 million chapatis every morning. So the scale of our operation is humongous, both in terms of what we do on a daily basis with cooking, but also procurement and all of the other initiatives around distribution and supply chain. And we had these assets that were underutilized. We also quickly realized that incrementally, more than 116 million families would be impacted almost on an instant, almost instantly within 24 hours with food shortages. So if you look at India's just labor dynamics, India's got close to 400 to 500 million people in the labor force, of which about 100 million are migrant labor force, which are split between 60 who work and 40 who are supported. And of those, about 6 million have relocated, the Shramiks as we call them. So we still have a labor force that is still very much where it meant to be. Not all of them have gone back, a very small fraction. And that labor force suddenly lost jobs. And a lot of these people, if you look at places like Dharavi, these people buy food every day. So they not only pay a premium, but they pay a premium on a daily basis. So if you were to look at the compounding impact of what income does to them in terms of food goes into 4 or 5 digits, something that is inconceivable for people like us. And we knew that more than 150 million such families would be incrementally impacted. So we started to really create a solution, and we were really helped by the amazing alumni of Akshay Patra, which run in hundreds of thousands. And like with Asha, Lakshmi, these people can do magic. A lot of these children, they're not children anymore, they are now professionals, have gone through the Akshay Patra system, and they stood up, they've created their own organization called IKEA. And they set up, they almost instantly said to our team, you tell us what to do and we'll get the ball rolling. And we created a different solution of distributing food to these vulnerable families. And we have served more than 65 million meals so far, and we continue to deliver a sort of triangulated solution. So those who cannot cook, we provide them a hot meal. Those who can, we provide them a grocery box, which has got supplies for about a month. And now we are also delivering these boxes to children who would have otherwise come to school and received a plate of food. So we are delivering grocery boxes to their homes. Now, all of this is extremely daunting, given the fact that our distribution challenges are immense, our mobility challenges are immense, but most importantly, I think our biggest challenge still remains around supply chain and distribution of food. And that has been brought to light in a way like never before during COVID.
Great. Great. Well, yeah, I think we very much are in line with wanting to mobilize the community and helping people from the very from the ground, make changes within their own own towns and own groups of individuals. So that's great. Urvashi, would you like to speak next on this topic?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, I think I'll speak one on the short term, the immediate short term challenges that this pandemic has thrown up, and what we're trying to do, how we're thinking about it, and the other would be on the slightly longer term, medium to longer term challenges, and again where our focus needs to lie from a policy perspective. So I think definitely, Mr. Shekhawat's already covered a lot of that in terms of the immediate term, getting food to people, especially during the lockdown. And it continues, a lot of the challenges continue, but during the lockdown, it was really exacerbated in terms of how do we get, food to people who need it the most, because our schools were shut down, our Anganwadi centers, where a lot of vulnerable families, children are provided hot cooked meals. Those had to be shut down because of social distancing norms, etc. So the government, of course, has come up with various measures, to replace these meals. They've sort of increased the amount of take-home rations which can be given to poor and vulnerable families. A lot of free supply of wheat and rice and preferred pulses, etc., as well as this one nation one ration card concept which has been brought in, which is basically that migrant workers and others should have access to fair price shops across the country. It should really not be limited to where they are. But wherever they are, they should have access. So that's being rolled out. It's being rolled out in stages. But by August, we are expecting that a very large number of beneficiaries should be covered with these national portability of ration cards. And of course, I think on the short term part, I think the civil society organizations, like Akshay Patra, of course, is a fantastic example of that. But so many others, and Niti Aayog, our CEO, Mr. Amitabh Kant, he's the chair of the Empowered Group 6 of Government of India, which is in charge of building these networks with civil society organizations, private sector at this time. Because it's very clear that, in this situation, in this extraordinary situation, the government alone is not going to be able to, really manage and especially reach the most vulnerable populations who really need this support the most. So we have tried to build these networks, and I think a lot of NGOs have done fantastic work at this time to reach out to migrant workers, to reach out to various other communities. So I think that is something that, in the short term, some of the measures, and of course a lot more needs to be done, even to iron out, supply chain issues, distribution issues, and that's something we are also working on constantly from, the government side. The other is on the slightly medium to longer term, and I think a lot of these issues have persisted in this space and still remain. So I think one is, food security, and I think that's what India's policies have historically been focused on, ramping up production of cereals. But now we really need to also look at dietary diversity. We also need to look at promoting other types of crops like, millets, for instance, which are nutrient rich. They're also conducive to being grown in water stressed areas. So we need to promote this sort of dietary diversification in a big way. And there needs to be a demand that is created, for different types of crops and food items. So I think that is something which is a big focus for us. The other is bringing in more coordination at the policy level, you know. So what we have in a structure in our ministries, in our departments, somebody else is looking at agriculture, somebody else might be looking at food supplies, you know, health is totally separate, nutrition is totally separate, and somewhere, you know, all of these intersect. So we have tried to create an umbrella under the Poshan Abhiyan program, which is a flagship program of the government. We've created a National Nutrition Council, and that is chaired by the Vice Chairman of Niti Aayog. And that is really a first step, you know, towards trying to bring, you know, more cohesion in our policy level decisions, you know, because without that, you know, agriculture is, you know, sort of doing separate things from nutrition. And we know that there's a huge link and a very close link between the two. So I think that's another priority for us, you know, on this side, which, you know, has been there before the pandemic, and we need to take it forward as well. The third is on fortification, and you know, we can discuss this more in the questions. But Niti Aayog itself has, you know, played a role in promoting food fortification. In fact, we've initiated a pilot on rice fortification in some districts across the country. So we are working very hard to you know, convince the policymakers, the decision makers of the evidence, you know, the huge body of evidence around fortification, and B, the modalities. Because again, I think the evidence is not so much of the issue. The issue is how will we do it, who will we do it, you know, who will do it, and how will we really get it to people who need it the most. So I think that is something that within the sort of umbrella of the Poshan Abhiyan, we're also working on. And finally, I think just engaging local communities, because in a lot of our policies and a lot of our decisions, sometimes that element does not get reflected quite as much as it should. So we're trying to use technology, because again, this is a time when, you know, you're necessarily not able to do home visits, and you're not able to really interact with communities one-on-one. So we're trying to use technology to really reach out to local communities, to obviously encourage them to, you know, adopt these positive behaviors, as I said, dietary diversification, etc., but also really understand their challenges, their local issues, so that we can feed that back into policy making. So I'll stop here, and then happy to, you know, take up any of these aspects in discussion.
Great. Thanks so much, Urvashi. It's very interesting to get your perspective from the policy side and from what the government is doing in the country. You know, again, in terms of the self-help groups, I know there are groups of women that are organizing all over the country, and, you know, distributing, creating their own PPE and distributing food. So I think there's definitely a lot to be said for mobilizing people on the ground. I will now hand it over to Sahil. I know, you know, you'll have some perspective on the policy side, as well as perhaps what business can do in this context. So I think I'll let him speak on that and a little bit more.
Thank you, Lakshmi, and thank you, Bridge India. I wanted to start by saying we live in a very interconnected global food system, and actually start with a quote from the Executive Director of the World Food Programme to the UN Security Council, and that by the end of this year, we are facing multiple famines of biblical proportions, with 265 million people at the brink of famine. And I think it's really important to look at the bigger picture and the humanitarian development nexus, and how that may also be impacted over the short and medium term. I wanted to start with some of the short-term drivers before looking at the longer-term drivers. So with COVID-19, we both had Bhavani and Urvashi talk about supply chain disruption. And I won't go into too much more detail on that, but I think what's worth noting is that we may well see continued and prolonged supply chain disruption as we have subsequent lockdowns, as we have new localized epidemics emerge in upcoming months, as we started to see in Beijing and in other parts of China as well. And also with the lockdowns and the loss of income, not just for migrant workers, but for the informal sector more broadly, the need for smart lockdowns, as has been seen in other parts of the world, hasn't been as particularly apparent. One of the other admittedly anecdotal concerns that I have, that I've been told from colleagues on the ground, is that farmers haven't been planting in the same way that they usually do during the lockdowns, due to fear of breaking curfew, fear of being beaten by police, etc. And I think it will be months until the effects of that are truly understood. And admittedly, if there are cereal reserves of 12 to 18 months, it may not be an issue in the short run, but taking into account farmer livelihoods and diversity of crops and nutrition, it could be really significant. And the final thing to say on the short term is it's not just COVID-19 that we are facing the worst locust outbreak globally for 25 years.
I didn't get that. Could you try again?
If not 70 years. And control operations are particularly apparent as these swarms can multiply 20 times. And in the medium term, I wanted to look at a few drivers as well. I'm part of the World Bank's Famine Action Mechanism Technical Working Group. And three things that have really been highlighted. Remittances are expected to drop 20% through this year. Humanitarian aid is set to nosedive as resources are being diverted through to direct COVID-19 response, through to vaccines, and often linked to GDP, and linked with the global economic recession that we're seeing as well. With an export-oriented economy such as India, the economic impact and how that impacts the access pillar of food security and food, and the affordability of food is especially important. However, there's a lot that we can do in the interim. Successful locust control operations have been done in the past. The FAO have immense expertise in this, but are particularly difficult with COVID-19 related lockdowns. So the importance of getting the right types of planes, sufficient agrochemicals, data, and able to actually get real-time data of where locust swarms are, and have both successful aerial and ground operations are incredibly important. Green zones, as has been elsewhere, are important to keep supply chains up and running, to extension to what Bhavani was saying earlier. And I would also echo what Urvashi said around both fortification and also possibly in the short run, the supplementation, as the impacts of COVID-19 on malnutrition have been substantive, both with lockdowns and vitamin D, food rations having less perishables, and likely lower proportions of fruit and veg with supply chain failure in upcoming months. And smart lockdowns can also be used with food vouchers, such as has been seen in Nairobi, where the use of food vouchers has kept agri-supply chains up and running. It means that food businesses have continued to have income and that they won't go under. And at the same time, it's enabled, since these vouchers can be used in multiple places, that food can actually be distributed in a safe way and not lead to an increase in cases. I finally wanted to wrap up looking at the medium and long term. And the economic impacts of this in India are going to be substantial. And I don't think this is going to be 6 months, but we're talking multiple years, if not possibly into the second half of this upcoming decade. And the need for an economic stimulus, as has been seen in much of the rest of the world, and domestic demand replacing much of international demand is increasingly apparent. And it's increasingly apparent that we're going to need a Keynesian response to this, and an increased one in upcoming weeks and months. And just to add, and I guess shifting into the business side of things to close, is looking at sort of agri-tech investment and the role that agri-tech has to play. So Urvashi was saying in terms of what can be done to increase yields, but it's more than that. It's the use, for example, of GMO and how we can have more hazard resilient crops with increased yields. It's new production mechanisms. It's new crops such as seaweed, which can be used in coastal communities without needing any freshwater fertilizer. And as you have an increasingly growing population with less and less fertile land, agri-tech will both be needed, not just to feed everyone, but also from the economic side of things to ensure sustained development across the country. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Sahil. Again, I'd like to remind everyone you can ask questions. Oh, I see we have one just as I said that. But yes, please feel free to enter that in the Q&A section or in the chat section, and we'll be addressing them at the end. But yes, as Sahil, I think it's definitely there are a lot of different ways of agri-tech to get involved, and involved with vitamin fortification as well. I think that can have a significant impact across the country, as Urvashi was saying. I know with GMOs, it's been a bit of a fraught topic within India because of some of the commercial terms that occurred with BT cotton when Monsanto launched that, and that there's been resistance to GMO crops in the country. But again, if this is a long-term problem and it becomes about more than just distribution, and it becomes about increasing the supply, then it could be worth considering if you're getting the right crops with the right commercial terms for small-scale farmers, and also taking into account any environmental issues as well. But thank you very much for those thoughts. And Suhrid, I think you could talk a bit more about the agribusiness perspective and what can be done in terms of addressing the food shortages on that end.
Yeah, sure. So before I talk about the business perspective, I thought I sort of frame my comments according to like these three principles of food security that I first came across them when I doing my first job when I was placed in the Ministry of Agriculture and Food Security in Sierra Leone. And so at that point, the UN had, they identified three pillars of food security through which kind of analyze the food security situation of a country. So the first pillar is the availability of food, which is, as it's obvious how much food is actually out there. Second is access, which largely boils down to affordability and how much of the population can afford the food. And the third is utilization, which I think the other speakers have spoken about, which is complicated. It includes things like how the food is distributed within households, how other complementary things like access to clean water come into play as well. But it's also to do with diverse diets and having balanced diets and having all your kind of nutrients needed to actually make sure the food you're eating benefits your health. What I would add to that is now we also need to look at the long-term sustainability to do with environmental degradation and for how many years can we sustain food supply and access to food. So I won't talk too much about the sustainability bit now, because I know we're talking more about the actual current situation, but if people have questions on that, I can get into that. But if you look at those three pillars, so if you look at availability, I think Bhavani mentioned India doesn't have a shortage of food as such, but we also talked about diversity. So when people say like India doesn't have a shortage of food as such, they're principally talking about grains like wheat and rice. So where production of wheat and rice for the last 30 to 40 years have grown rapidly, and India now has massive stocks of these products and a huge surplus. And if you look at the current situation, we've had a record wheat harvest. We've also got another very good monsoon forecasted. So I think availability of grains is not going to be an issue over the coming months. The other key food grain we need to look at is pulses, because that's the main source of protein in India through dal. So historically, India had become the biggest importer of pulses in the world. One reason is because the focus was all on kind of promoting better varieties of wheat and rice, which saw farmers focusing more on grains production and less on pulses production. That's improved recently, like in the last 3-4 years, pulses production has increased, but the fact that India still needs a small amount of pulses imports to meet its requirements, it should be something to flag up, just because I know that there have been supply problems. There have been disruptions at the ports, where ports like Kandla, there have been labor shortages, and once the labor kind of went back to the villages, the ports were working at restricted capacity, and generally globally there's been a problem with disruption in container trade. But overall, I think it's not, I feel that the situation with pulses supply won't be that bad for India, just because the import requirement has decreased in recent years. And also, if you look at the report from the field, people are planting more pulses this year as well. And if the monsoon is good, it will benefit not just the upcoming monsoon season, but also it will improve like water availability for the winter crop as well. I think the bigger problem might be to do with vegetables. So, and the reason why that is because the vegetables are perishable. So with grains and pulses, you can grow everything in one go and kind of store it. With vegetables, you need to continuously keep growing and keep harvesting vegetables. And one problem that farmers had during the lockdown was like they had a very good vegetable crop, but then the prices crashed because of the lockdown. They couldn't trade, they couldn't get it out, get the produce out to the right markets. And usually what happens in India when prices of vegetables crash the next season, farmers lose confidence and then they go back to planting safer crops like wheat and sugarcane, and then there's a spike in prices. Secondly, so that's something we should maybe look out for. Come September, October, there might be a lower harvest of hit to availability of vegetables. And in general, as the monsoon starts, vegetable supply generally does decrease in India, and people live in Indian cities will know that prices shoot up during sort of June, July, early August. So that's something to be careful about. In terms of access, I think this is probably much more important. So I think those people who've studied stuff by like writers like Amartya Sen, he kind of talked about how the last time there was a big famine in India, which was in West Bengal in the 1940s, there wasn't actually a shortage of food. There was enough food there, but people couldn't afford it. So a lot of the rice supply was diverted away from rural areas into cities and to feed soldiers, European soldiers in the war. And also there was issues with like fishermen who, when that kind of shot up the price of rice, but there was issues with fishermen who couldn't, when they sold the fish, what the income they were getting was not enough for them to afford rice. So there wasn't a shortage of rice, but there was people's ability to afford food got hit. And I think that's something, if you look at the current situation in India, we need to sort of think about. So a lot of migrant workers have been made unemployed. So straight away, they've lost their kind of daily earnings. Then a lot of them have gone back to villages. So once they're in villages, they also start competing for labor with the existing labor daily wage earners in villages. So that could put pressure on wages within villages. Secondly, as more people return to villages, it's not just workers, there's also like, I know people in professionals working in cities like Indore and Pune have now gone back to the villages. So they're sort of adding to the demand for food in villages. So you've got kind of people, the daily wage earners wages going down. You've got demand for food in villages going up, and potentially a hit in supply in the early part of the monsoon. So that's something maybe just to flag up, policy makers should be aware of. And I think what Rishi said, they are looking at Niti Aayog, and the government is looking at expanding the public distribution and the ration allowances people have. So that could be one way of tackling it. Another way of tackling it is to expand Marega and employ more labor in activities like creating assets, or maybe even using the labor to using Narega programs to encourage labor in vegetable farming, which is a labor-intensive activity. In terms of utilization, this is quite technical, so I wouldn't talk too much about it, but what I'll say is it kind of goes back to the point that others have been making about diversity of diet. So just to give a couple of examples, I was speaking to someone yesterday who had done some work in a village in Chhattisgarh, and there all the villages had access to food rations, and so they got their wheat and they got their rice and dal and had enough of that to eat, but there's still a lot of malnourishment and stunting in growth, and that's because they weren't eating any vegetables. So, and about another 2 years ago, I did some work with NGOs in the Konkan area of Maharashtra, and it's the same thing there, where the NGOs were encouraging them to grow more vegetables, not just to diversify the income, but also for their own nutrition, because before that they weren't eating any vegetables. So I think, yeah, so diversity of diets is a big issue, and I think it's all interconnected, because if you get farmers to grow more a diverse range of produce, not only are you making the food supply to the country more diverse, but you're also building the farmers' own economic resilience. You're diversifying their income streams. You're giving them continuous cash flow through the year, rather than them just being dependent on one or two like grains harvests a year. So that also improves their access to food as well. In terms of sustainability, I think that's probably the biggest challenge going forward. If you look at India's water resources, they're already under stress. There's also soil resources are coming under pressure, and the quality of the soil is going down. With India's population is still growing, and it's getting richer, and it's demanding more kind of diverse basket of food. So if you're going to be able to keep supplying that demand, then those water and soil resources are going to come increasingly under greater strain. So we need to find ways of producing more but with less resources. So that's where technology can come in, things to do with like precision farming, cold chain to reduce losses, sustainable seaweed. I've heard a lot about that and what sort of role that can play as well. And again, it goes back to diversity as well, because I think there's an need to diversify production, not just for all the reasons I've explained earlier, but also from an environmental point of view. So wheat, rice, they use a lot of water, pulses don't. So ideally you should be kind of growing wheat and rice where you have water, and pulses where you don't. They also, like, by growing wheat and rice and pulses in rotation with each other, it helps to conserve the soil. But if you're just growing wheat and rice straight, continuously in a kind of monocrop, it's very taxing on the soil. So there's a lot of interrelated things, and I think it does come down to diversity and improving productivity. So you're producing more but with less resources.
Great. Yeah, that provides a really nice framework for understanding this whole issue in terms of availability and access and utilization, and finally sustainability, and how they're all interconnected in terms of choice of crops and what kind of technologies we're deploying. So thank you very much for providing that perspective and that overview. I think we'll take the next 20 minutes to answer any questions from the audience. I think the first one is from Sumita. It's for Urvashi. So is this the right time for the government to push through big policy reforms to get better coordination between ministries that you referred to as a problem? So I guess, if you refer to an umbrella organization, is it time to get more of that?
Yeah, so I was talking of, something which would require fundamental restructuring, which might be obviously very difficult to do, when you're in the middle of a crisis. Because what we have been suggesting from, I think, Niti Aayog, and it's come from various other people, that we have this artificial sort of silos that we have created. Why should nutrition be in a separate ministry from health, for instance, right? Because ultimately one of the biggest determinants of good health is nutrition. And now that we have a huge burden of non-communicable diseases in the country also, nutrition becomes even more important, because now we are dealing not just with undernutrition, but we're also dealing with the other side. We're also dealing with people who might be more overweight or obese. So so we are dealing with a very complex gamut of issues, and they are very closely linked. So why should we have this sort of artificial silos? I guess that is where that thought process is coming from. But that might be something that will take a little bit of time. It's not easy to immediately restructure ministries and departments. But what we have started to do under a program, say like the Poshan Abhiyan, we have started to bring together ministries and different sectors under this. So for instance, just recently we have launched this initiative, the Ministry of Women and Child Development, under whom nutrition really comes at the national policy level, to work with a lot of experts on the agriculture side, as well as the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, to develop India's first Poshan Atlas. So India's first nutrition atlas, which is basically going to be a repository of diverse crops across around 127 agroclimatic zones of the country. And the whole purpose is to encourage crop and dietary diversification. So this atlas is going to have information on food items that are traditionally consumed, crop varieties that are currently grown, and given the agroecological context, the soil, organic, carbon content, the groundwater availability, etc., offer guidance on how greater diversity of crops could be encouraged in a particular district. So these are the kind of initiatives that we have started to, till such time that we are able to undertake large-scale restructuring of our ministries, departments, programs. At least within our flagship programs, we have started to, bring in these elements of coordination, linkages between agriculture and nutrition. So I think we should at least persist with that, and hopefully then in the medium to slightly longer term, we see even a restructuring, of our existing government structures.
Yeah, and if you don't mind if I ask a follow-up question for that, does there need to be, more of a link between nutrition and health as well? Because obviously, healthy people are less likely to get COVID-19 infection, all of that. So are you seeing a linkage there, or is that something that needs to be established as well?
Yeah, no, so that's what I was speaking about, that, nutrition, it's affecting all ends. It's under nutrition affects health in different ways. Over sort of nutrition, or the wrong kind of nutrition, is also causing problems. And that's why we are seeing a large burden of non-communicable diseases. So that's exactly the link I was, referring to, that is why we need this sort of artificial silos between health, nutrition, agriculture, all of these to break down somewhere. But that often takes a lot of time, if you're trying to restructure ministries and departments. But you can do it much more swiftly at a programmatic level. And that is why in the Poshan Abhiyan, we've already brought in these linkages. At a programmatic level, at least between nutrition and agriculture, we are trying to push it forward in a big way. And specifically during the pandemic, we are looking at public health strategies, which include nutrition. So on slums, Mr. Shekhawat spoke about slums, and slums are also areas where we are seeing large outbreaks of the infection. I think it's quite clear that the pandemic is largely an urban phenomenon, and especially in the densely populated clusters, slum areas of Mumbai and Delhi and other large metros. So we're trying to also work on nutrition specifically for these areas. Because these are already very vulnerable populations, which become even more vulnerable at such times. So I think definitely, strategies like supplementation or other short-term strategies we are, pushing forward, and we're trying to work with the city governments, because this then really comes down to a very micro level of, action and decision making. So yeah, I think at the programmatic level, a lot of those links are also recognized, acknowledged. We're also working on a lot of those. But I think fundamentally, we will need to revisit the whole structure, because till that happens, some of these silos will unfortunately not go away. So that is why I mentioned that as a critical, medium to longer term point, that, something we really need to keep pushing for, is to not have these sort of artificial separation between health, nutrition, sanitation, agriculture, a lot of these, clean drinking water and water resources. There's so many interlinkages, gender. So somewhere we need to really bring in these in a much more systematic way in our policy architecture.
Great, thank you very much.
If I may, I think, if I may, I think, it's fascinating to hear all of this, Urvashi, and we must also acknowledge that in many ways, India is way ahead of many other countries in the way it is tackling or solving for nutrition. And I say this with a lot of evidence. If you look at the UN SDGs, which I referred to earlier on, we still refer to solving for hunger as our number 2 priority. We are still solving for hunger. And as we have seen evidence in the United Kingdom and many of the Western world, that sometimes in solving for hunger, we create a nutrition problem. If you look at reliance on food banks, the kind of food that is serviced via food banks might be solving for hunger, but the kind of food, and Suhrid, I think, referred to it in terms of diversity and the range of food groups that we must consume, it is shocking. So in solving for hunger, I think globally we have created, or at least abetted, a nutrition problem. And India is way ahead of the others, because I think at least at the policy level, what I see coming out of Niti Aayog and many other think tanks, including Indian Institute of Science in Bangalore, where we are working very closely on various nutrition initiatives, or even NIN, we see nutrition as a focus in India, not just hunger. Because I think at a deeper level, we acknowledge that if we solve for nutrition, we might better solve the hunger problem. But if we solve for hunger, we might actually accentuate a nutrition problem. Even at Akshaya Patra, we are now not just looking at providing food. We've been doing this for years now. We are fortifying rice kernels. We are introducing folic acid and iron into our diet. I think there's a question around millets. We've started looking at, not just looking at the breakfast that we provide in Chennai, are millet based. We are bringing back some of these food groups like ragi and bajra and pearl millet, etc., back into. So the point really is that there is a lot that we need to do. And India is a complex problem, because we have all 3 issues of availability, access, and affordability. And all of them. So you may have availability, not have access, and you may have access, you can't afford it. But in addition to that, at a policy level, and increasingly, there is and I'm really pleased and enthusiastic about the direction we are taking in terms of solving for nutrition. It needs more momentum, but I think we are doing the right things. We are not just solving, like, for example, and that's my final point on this, is that we are not just solving for stunting and wasting. As a country, we just don't say malnutrition is only between 0 to 3 or 3 to 6 or between the time that a mom is pregnant or lactating. We actually look at malnutrition between 6 and 16, which is absolutely an absent area in many other parts of the world. So we are looking, at least at a policy level, and whether it is through ICDS in the early years, the Integrated Child Development Scheme, or the current policy initiatives, we are in the right direction. A lot more needs to be done. And I think the focus of the next 3 to 5 years, and what the pandemic has highlighted, is that we need momentum. And we need momentum both from the policymakers, from enterprise, as well as the civil society. So whether it is agri-tech or whether it is combining all of these ministries, we need more collaboration. And I think that's been the biggest insight. The urgency to build momentum around collaborative efforts is the new normal for us going forward.
Yeah, thank you very much for those points. I think, yeah, definitely more conversation and collaboration is the way to go with that. I think there was a question about the locust specifically from Didar. He wants to know why did the locust problem happen in India? Were there not measures already in place to get it under control quickly? Is it a once in a generation phenomenon, or could we have done something differently to prevent it? I think Sahil, you brought up the locust, so I think I'll hand that one to you.
Sure. Well, locusts are a migratory pest. So locust swarms can travel over 100 miles a day. So this current locust outbreak that we're facing actually stems back to winter 2018-19, where it was an off-season storm actually in the Gulf of Africa and Eastern Africa, which is where we saw the start of this locust outbreak. And we saw successive failed control operations, and successful to a certain extent. What could have been done differently? It's difficult in terms of what India could have done differently. Locusts are not like human beings. Locusts do not respect national geographical borders. Although because they don't tend to transcend into colder climes, they're unlikely to go past the Himalayas. There were some successful operations that have been done. You might have heard about ducks being sent. There were some drone operations. But just the sheer size of swarms, the hopper bands, the laying of eggs, which are incredibly difficult to find and require field control teams, means that it's not a simple thing to do, especially when we haven't seen a locust outbreak in India like this for over 30 years. So many of the people that do have expertise do need to be flown in and are dealing with the locust outbreaks in many other parts of Southwest Asia, the Gulf, and the Horn of Africa. In terms of, is this a one-off? I wish I could say it was. There's really interesting may be the wrong word. There are substantive links between locust outbreaks and climate change, where especially large amounts of rains, off-season rains, provide fertile breeding grounds for locusts. And it's only when locusts have sufficient breeding grounds and there's enough critical mass that they start to form swarms. So I do think in upcoming years and decades, we'll start to see locust swarms as we're seeing now more significantly, and within the climate adaptation community, and looking at food security within a climate adaptation lens. I think ensuring that India has the expertise, ensuring that it has the right materials, whether that's both planes and agrochemicals, are incredibly important to stem with early locust outbreaks before they start to multiply rapidly. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, I think it's an issue that a lot of people weren't aware of, so I think it's good to highlight. So the next question is for Suhrid. Sustainable food security is directly related to access to productive resource. This is from Neetu Sharma. A lot of migration has been happening from drought-prone areas with no irrigation facilities. How is that affecting sustainable food security for small farmers?
So I think I can call on the example of two particular sort of drought-prone districts where I've done some work with had some kind of interaction with it. One is Kutch in Gujarat, and the other is Solapur in Maharashtra. So like both of them are quite, I think Kutch, it's a semi-desert, so it's always had water shortages and low rainfall. In Solapur, it's got worse over time. This rainfall levels have fallen over the decades, and some people also said the excessive growing of sugarcane has depleted water resources there. What I would say is like there are success stories in those areas, and a lot of it's to do with finding ways of managing water better. So in Kutch, for example, I know NGOs, very good NGOs who've done a lot of good work in building things like check dams, which help to, so when the rainfall kind of hits the ground, it instead of running off, it kind of collects in a spot, and then it kind of like recharges the local groundwater level. And if you combine that with kind of more sustainable irrigation practices like drip, you can have water throughout the year. And in Kutch, they have farmers successfully going things like pomegranates, dates, very high value crops. So it can be done. Similarly in Sholapur as well, farmers are growing a lot of high value crops, not just sugarcane, but also pomegranate. And what I find is in drought prone areas, when people are kind of forced to kind of think about water conservation, they're quicker to adapt things like drip irrigation and quicker to find kind of more drought resilient crops. But it doesn't mean it's going to happen like automatically. So I gave the example in Kutch, where one NGO is actually actively taking the initiative and making those investments. So I think, and similar in Maharashtra, I think under the last government, they made a lot of, in particular in the Marathwada region of Maharashtra, they help farmers with subsidies to invest in farm ponds to help with their water harvesting and water management practices. So I think it's not a case of you can't grow crops in drought prone areas. You have to find solutions, practical solutions, as well as like technological solutions.
Right. There was another question about whether universal basic income is a way to address this, and I think people have submitted their responses. But there's a related query about whether the rural community, the rural economy, will recover from this huge dislocation in the next year, and is it likely that the government will provide some sort of basic income to support that, or cash transfer to support that? I think, Bhavani, I'll let you address that first, and then maybe Urvashi, if you want to jump in.
Well, thanks for that. It's a great question. It's a great question for two reasons. Because one thing that has been brought to light as a result of this pandemic, and we talked about indicators, is what is truly rural in India. A few years ago, an organization, I think it was Nielsen, that created a little comparative study for the country and said, the largest segment that's growing in India is called the urban India. So it's neither rural nor urban. And most of our, even what we saw in the 90s, the migration from villages to the cities, periphery of the cities. So a lot of our rural definitions are interesting to look at right now. So truly what is rural India is a question, because there is enough of rural India in our urban India, and there's enough of urban sort of lifestyle in some of our villages. So will this lead to a migration back to the basics, if I may? So you could be living a farm life in the middle of Bangalore, or you could be living a hugely consumerist life somewhere in a village in Odisha. It's a question that is still a question. I think people are beginning to realize the value of being back to basics. So that is true. Some of the work that we have done with the communities that we work with, and with other organizations and think tanks, this point that people are, of course, as a part of this readjustment, reset, people are saying, do I really need to spend 350 rupees on a popcorn and watch a movie at PVR in Delhi? Or is there another way for me to enjoy cinema? And we are now beginning to see cinema releases on Amazon Prime, so on and so forth. So I think, will there be lifestyle changes? I would definitely think so. And they'll be dictated by three broad themes. Clearly, there is an economic challenge. Then there might be a redistribution of access. And the third is new learning. right? So will there be lifestyle changes, and will those lifestyle changes point back to basics, etc.? The question around universal incomes is an interesting question, because what we are, for example, seeing in England is the minimum wage and the living wage are increasingly becoming disparate. So what is universal income, right? What is the best indicator for universal income? So that's in itself is a very, very good question. And there was another question: does that mean that we will rise on the Global Health Index or Global Happiness Index, GHI? That's a very good question, because it really is time for all of us to start looking at metrics differently. To me personally, there is no point in saying we are the third largest economy or the fourth largest economy in the world. It just doesn't make sense, because we are number 139 on an economy that is run well, that contributes to happy, healthy citizens. So there might be 3 countries ahead of us on GDP, but on average per capita, there are 138 countries that are ahead of us. And I think which one do we look at, and which one do we focus on, and which one do we try and address is going to be the bigger question. And similarly, truly how do we redefine urban rural landscapes, truly how we define incomes, truly how do we look at income parity, truly how we look at redistribution of these income so that access to food becomes better. And then finally, how do we redefine our sort of incidence on better food, nutrition, and all of the other things that come along with it, are very good questions that I think have come to not just the limelight, but are capturing a lot more people and a lot more attention now as a result of the pandemic.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I mean, I wonder if there's a way to incentivize people to take up kind of a rural lifestyle through a cash transfer potentially. If you get certain benefits, if you're producing certain food, I think that would be an interesting perspective.
For example, the incentives on vertical farming, or in Bangalore, there is this initiative called Uta from Your Thota, where you are able to build a really sustainable solution in your home for all your vegetables and herbs, whether it is incentivizing hydroponics in states like the Uttarakhand, the region, or whether it is solar farming, even using saline water in Rajasthan. Some of those are very, very interesting initiatives. Are they totally rural? I'm not entirely sure. Are they only there to help the rural communities? I'm not entirely sure. But they will they get and should more attention? Olive farming, for example, in Rajasthan, with support from countries like Israel. All of these things are gaining momentum, right? And if anything, the pandemic has only given them a lot more impetus. Does that improve rural India? I don't know. But does that improve a lifestyle which goes back to the basics and a little bit better understood approach to how we should live, love, learn, and go about our lives? The answer is yes.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Vani and Urvashi and Suhrid and Sahil. I think we have a feedback poll. I'm going to put it was excellent, but I can't vote. No, okay. Well, thank you all very much for joining. Again, if you would like to volunteer with Asha for Education, you can contact us at london@ashanet.org. You can donate to our food disbursement initiatives at london.ashanet.org. And again, thank you very much to Bridge India for organizing this webinar. Thanks again to our speakers, and thank you to all of our attendees. We very much appreciate your questions and your participation. And I think collaboration is the way forward, as our panelists were saying. So let's continue to have more conversations like this, and hopefully initiatives will come out of it as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me and all of us.
Thank you.
Lovely to meet the panelists, and thank you, Bridge India.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.